Well, welcome to the 700 Club. The nation's eyes will be on the polls in Virginia and New Jersey next week. Voters go to elect their new governors, and the results of these races are expected to predict next year's midterm congressional election.
And after the 2020 presidential election, both parties called for major voting reform legislation. So what would that look like? Drastically different for Democrats than for Republicans. Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson explains.
While both Republicans and Democrats have made election integrity a major part of their platform in state and federal races, the parties are taking very different approaches toward reform.
It's ludicrous for any Republican to assert that the federal government has no role to play in safeguarding elections.
Democrats recently failed to advance the Freedom to Vote Act in the Senate. The measure would expand early and mail-in voting, allow for automatic and same-day voter registration, ease ID requirements, and prevent what they call voter suppression.
It would put in all kinds of very bad provisions that would make elections more insecure and really cause problems in future elections.
Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation argues that voter suppression isn't a problem.
That is evidenced by the fact that, for example, in the last election last year, we had the highest turnout in an election since 1992, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So the idea that there's voter suppression going on is just belied by the evidence.
States under GOP control, like Texas and Georgia, are passing bills that include ID requirements for absentee ballots, revised times for early voting, and bans unsolicited requests for mail-in ballots.
The best way to inspire confidence is to fix the vulnerabilities that currently exist, and that's what a number of states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, and others, they've passed election reform bills to actually try to fix some of those problems.
Spakovsky tells CBN News states should also conduct audits after elections.
The whole point of an audit is not to overturn a prior election, but to make sure that all the laws and regulations were followed, that everyone was able to vote who was eligible to vote, that the equipment all worked the way it should.
With former President Trump doubling down on claims of widespread voter fraud in 2020, the question remains how that might affect turnout in close statewide governor races like New Jersey and Virginia.
If voters believe that the system is rigged and their vote isn't going to count, then that's certainly a disincentive to vote.
Inside Elections' Nathan Gonzalez told CBN News despite those claims, he believes voters from both parties will show up at the polls.
I think in the case of Virginia, Republicans are anxious to send a message to President Joe Biden and the Democrats, and I think that any concerns about the system will be overcome with enthusiasm to send a message.
Gonzalez believes no matter who wins these upcoming races, claims of fraud or vote rigging by the party that loses are likely to follow. Reporting from Virginia, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Well, CBN chief political analyst David Brody joins us from our Washington bureau to tell us more on this. David, let me take you all the way back to 2000 and the famous hanging chads of Florida. In the aftermath of that, Florida passed a lot of election reforms. This past election just last year, they were, frankly, a model state and reported their results on time. So what flaws are states trying to address this year, and is it enough?
Well, it's a good question, Gordon. And you're right. Florida's kind of been the model for that, if you will. Look, there's a lot of different flaws, and Abby pointed some of them out, but let's start with voter identification. I mean, you know, remember, Democrats believe that voter ID is voter suppression. We can get into that in a moment. But beyond all of that, you got voter drop boxes, certain places, you know, left in parks, possibly unmanned, obviously, at times. Signature verification's been a big one. Mail-in balloting. So if you kind of look at it in totality, you've got two different versions here. You've got the Republicans saying, hey, we need to shore up election integrity. And you got the Democrats saying, well, hold on for a second. More rules and regulations means more voter suppression. And that's kind of been the big debate going on all along here, Gordon.
Well, from I guess my casual observation, you ought to be able to require that there be an actual identification that this person has the right to vote and the right to vote in this precinct. That just seems to make sense to me. Why is that somehow voter suppression?
No, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, Democrats bring up this idea of folks that are low income, that don't have the necessary means to get a certain voter ID, but Republicans go, give me a break. I mean, it's not just about having a driver's license. There's all different types of voter ID that you can show, and it doesn't even mean a card. I mean, you can literally show a piece of paper that has your address on it or whatever you happen to be. So, look, I think that's been a big part of it. But I also think there's this big H.R. 1 that we've heard about, right? This bill that Democrats have been wanting to pass. Really, it's their #1 priority. They even say that. And the Republicans have been able to fight back against that because Democrats want to federalize elections. That's what they want to do with this bill. Republicans have been able to beat that back, and they say, of course we can't federalize elections. And that's kind of been the bigger issue here in terms of how much, when you start to federalize elections, when you start to have more mail-in balloting, when you start to have more of a kind of an all-encompassing, for example, absentee voting, more absentee voting, you lose control of the process and you lose election integrity in the process.
Well, wasn't there a bipartisan commission that actually pointed that out, that one of the greatest abuses that could happen, I think no less than George Mitchell was on that panel, and they specifically pointed out mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting, where people can go and collect ballots and then put them in as a group, that those were the prime areas that you could have voter fraud.
Well, you're absolutely right, Gordon. I'm glad you brought that up. That was George Mitchell, a Democrat, James Baker, a Republican, putting out that study as the heads of the study that Republicans point to all the time and say, look, even a bipartisan study shows that this is not a good idea. You mentioned ballot harvesting real quick, and that is part of what the Democrats want is H.R. 1, this federalizing of election. What do we mean by ballot harvesting? Just so we understand it here. Basically, you can just go and drop off a ballot at a local precinct or wherever it is of someone else's ballot. You can drop off someone else's ballot at a local precinct. Now, I will say that in California, that is legal. You can do that in the state of California. I believe it's one other state in the country, North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, also allows you to do that. But the Democrats want to do it federally, and the Republicans are like, wait a minute. We don't need the Wild West here, and that's what they think it'll be.
Well, I mean, the abuse from that is just obvious. Just imagine an employer saying, you have to turn in your ballot to me, and then I'll turn it in for you. Right. And if you want to continue getting a paycheck, this is how you're going to do it. The abuse is just painfully obvious. I don't understand, why would you want that kind of provision? Because that clearly can lead to strong-arm tactics.
Well, and it gets back to politics. I mean, Democrats are very good at this, and don't take my word for it. I mean, it's very well documented. It's something called granny farming. It's a form of ballot harvesting. In essence, going around to nursing homes, Democrat operatives going around to nursing homes and saying, to an 82-year-old in a nursing home, hey, here's some suggestions on how you might want to vote. And they go ahead and say, okay, just put my name down, and they sign away, and they bring the ballot in. That's what they do in California. It's called granny farming. It's a very interesting concept that is extremely controversial, and many people think immoral.
All right. Well, David, thanks for the analysis, and hopefully we won't federalize these rules, and we'll allow states to draft their own rules. That's been the pattern in the United States for a couple of centuries. In other news, the terrorist threat from Afghanistan is now accelerating. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That is right, Gordon. A top Pentagon official told Congress he's certain Islamic State and al-Qaeda intend to launch attacks against the United States from Afghanistan. That warning coming from Undersecretary for Defense Policy Colin Kahl, who testified Tuesday before the Senate Armed Services Committee.
The intelligence community's assessment is that ISIS-K could potentially develop a capability within 6 to 12 months, and that al-Qaeda could potentially develop that capability within 1 to 2 years. We have considerable evidence that they have the intent. The question at the moment is the capability.
Kahl also testified there are 439 American citizens still in Afghanistan, and that the State Department is in contact with 196 who are ready to leave the country. Well, another important issue for Congress, big tech and the dangers to children online. The big question, are social media giants doing enough to protect kids, and should the government step in? As CBN's Brody Carter reports, representatives from TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat faced tough questions Tuesday on Capitol Hill.
As these three players see great growth in young users, they're also out to prove they've implemented safeguards. This after recent headlines highlighted how Facebook business practices could negatively impact children. Now, for the first time, lawmakers are working to put privacy regulations on big tech.
Kids as young as 9 have died doing viral challenges on TikTok. And we've seen teen girls lured into inappropriate sexual relationships with predators on Snapchat.
Protecting children from the ills of the internet took priority for the Senate Commerce Subcommittee. The main takeaway?
You cannot trust big tech with your kids.
The names and faces behind TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat were questioned about their safeguards for children under 13. Senators wanting specifics on areas such as data collection, algorithms putting ads and sexual content in front of children, plus content ranging from glorifying eating disorders to self-harm to violence.
First of all, where kids play, predators prey.
Donna Rice Hughes with Enough is Enough wants to stop Instagram from starting its kids platform and needs help to do it by getting signatures supporting internet regulation. For example, did you know when it comes to those 18 and under that 43% speak to strangers regularly online at least once a week? Over 40% have either sent or received a sext message, and perhaps most shocking, kids under 10 represent 22% of that group's online porn consumption.
Some of these companies have taken some steps, but it's not enough.
Tuesday, lawmakers shared what they found after creating fake accounts across all platforms, imitating teens and adolescents.
An invite to play an online sexualized video game, tips on, quote, why you shouldn't go to bars alone, and articles about porn stars.
As legislators seek to protect kids, TikTok's relations with communist China raise concern for our national security.
Okay, so you're refusing to answer the question. That does not give this committee any confidence that TikTok is doing anything other than participating in Chinese propaganda and espionage on American
Senator,
children.
that's not accurate. And again, I would point you to
if it were not accurate, you would answer the questions, and you have dodged the questions more than any witness I have seen in my 9 years serving in the Senate.
One shared tactic admitted by each company is a metric used to keep you and your children using TikTok, Snapchat, and YouTube for as long as possible.
So we have had almost 3 decades of big tech not having any kind of accountability or regulation.
Lawmakers are now working to stop lucrative practices, especially these that prey on kids and keep them in front of the screen. In the meantime, experts say parents must assume the burden of being the first line of defense.
Parents, it starts with us, and we have to make those changes first, and then we can help our kids begin to make changes if we're out of control in this area.
The Senate subcommittee will review data from research conducted by each company on how their products affect kids. The future of big tech and questions of regulation remain uncertain. I'm Brody Carter, CBN News.
Thank you, Brody. Gordon, some of those statistics about kids' online behavior and activities just disturbing and shocking.
Oh, it's sort of beyond shocking. So, Ashley, tell us, how bad is it out there?
Well, I'm a little bit older than 18 years old, and but, I mean, I have a niece and a nephew, and I think of them being exposed to, I mean, the stat were 10 years and younger, 20-something, however, I mean, it's just ridiculous. They're being exposed to porn at such a young age on those platforms. It's really disturbing, and so I do agree that parents, you are the first line of defense. Maybe give it a second thought of allowing your children to be on those platforms at such a young age.
You can monitor what apps they have access to.
Yeah.
You can actually say, well, you don't get to have TikTok. You don't get to have these social media platforms. Do you think that Congress can actually come up with any legislation?
Probably, but I'm not sure it's really going to stop anything. I think.
Why is that? Because people will figure a way around it?
Yeah, and I think the algorithms are smarter than we think. I think.
They're a lot smarter than
Yeah, exactly.
And
so.
the problem is they're getting smarter all the time.
Yeah.
As the race to AI takes over, they know a whole lot about you, and they are using those algorithms. And the amazing thing is you're the product. You are your behavior, what you do online is now their product, and they're selling that information to advertisers who are looking for your profile. So the key here is how quickly can they get you addicted to it? And if they can get you addicted to it when you're a child, well, then they've got you for a lifetime, and they're going to make money off you every single year.